What's up, legends, and welcome back to another Unmatched First Impressions video. Today I'm going over the second hero from the new Unmatched Marvel Teen Spirit box. I would like to point out, and this is something I forgot to say in the Cloak and Dagger video, but in the top of the description below there will be a link to buy this game from Restoration Games. You can purchase it for order right now, and if you do so, it even comes with a set of foils, one for each hero. Those are pretty cool, and this is, spoiler alert, in my opinion, the best Marvel set so far. So I definitely recommend purchasing this set. And yeah, if you're a fan of the game, fan of Unmatched, it's usually a no-brainer. But just in case you needed like any little bit of convincing, that was it. So go buy the set. Today we're talking about Miss Marvel in a first impressions video. So what that means for me is that I will be going over the character, their ability, all of their cards, and then I'll give you a prediction about how good I think they're going to be in the meta, how good each of their cards are going to be. This is a fun little experiment because most of the time I'm not quite on target, and it's really fun comparing reality in like 6 months, a year from now, to what I thought about the character when they were first coming out. Sometimes I'm horribly wrong, T-Rex, but sometimes I'm horribly right. Don't have an example for that one, which means I probably haven't been horribly right so far. Today we're talking about Miss Marvel, who is not Elastigirl. Maybe. And that's about my extent of understanding for the character. Looking at her card back, you can see that they are following the kind of trend in this set with having the initials somewhere on the card back, which I think I like from an aesthetic perspective, because I like when the card backs for a set are all like coherent. They kind of go together, because then just when you're like glancing at all of the card backs when you're like picking a fighter for a tournament, you can be like, oh, like in my head, like, oh, those are the initial card backs. Those are from Teen Spirit. Like they go together. That it's just nice for me. And like, why wouldn't they have the card backs match for a set? So the volume 2 ones kind of don't, but I think that's an exception because most of the time they have some sort of pattern. Not my favorite, I think, but I like the fist breaking the fourth wall or the outline of the card back. I think her health dial has the same effect too, which is neat. Her ability, well, her stats, let's start there. Miss Marvel is a melee hero with 14 health, a move value of 2, and just as a reminder, I think Hat Chowder would want you to know this, a hero is just someone who tries to do the right thing even when it's hard. So this stat line looks kind of underwhelming, but her ability really makes up for that, and in fact makes her quite good. So let's learn about Stretchy and why it is insane. So Stretchy says, at the start of your turn, you may move Miss Marvel 1 space. Miss Marvel can attack from up to 2 spaces away, ignoring zones. So Bruce Lee, for reference, his ability is that at the end of his turn, he can move 1 space, which doesn't seem like much, but it's actually one of the best abilities in the game because it helps him kite like a madman. He'll basically never get double attacked by a melee fighter. Makes him really good in certain matchups. Now, moving at the start of your turn, it's kind of like an inverse Bruce Lee. It's like a mini Moon Knight hop, except this happens every turn because Miss Marvel doesn't switch forms. And her second ability pairs really well with it because being able to attack from up to 2 spaces away is like a large fighter, like the T-Rex can do. And that is quite good because being melee, but not being adjacent to your opponent when you attack them, amazing, because range is better than melee if you can help it, except this is like, it doesn't have to do with zones at all. It's just about positioning and being 1 space away. So let's say at the start of your turn, you move 1 space with your ability. 1 space with your ability. Then you move 2. So you're kind of like a move 3 fighter for the first maneuver of your turn. Not horrible. And then you can attack an opponent 1, 2 spaces away. So basically, you started your turn 5 spaces away from your opponent, and you're making a melee attack on them that's not melee, and you didn't boost. kind of crazy. I forget who exactly came up with this term. It might have been Jacqueline or Chad, but someone said that Miss Marvel is a move 4 fighter, and that is scarily accurate. So being solo and move 2 in this scenario is like it's not as bad as it is for other solo fighters like Jekyll and Hyde, because that free move and then also like the stretch range is just incredible. Like both of these abilities, like separately, like would be fine. But together they give her such a high performance floor because of the extra mobility and the kind of like defensiveness of being able to attack from not adjacent. She just doesn't put herself in vulnerable positions as often as other heroes would. And really the only way she's going to get multiple attacks thrown at her on a turn is against ranged fighters who position well, and against characters with after combat movement abilities like Sinbad, who can move up when she attacks second action on her turn. But in other matchups, she's going to be an absolute menace to kite around with. And just, I think if you can master this kind of positioning, your opponent is going to have such a tough time. Some other things I like about this deck: she has 11 unique cards, and one of those cards is a one-off, which I believe means she has 9 3-copy cards, 1 2-copy card, and 1 1-copy card, which is probably one of the most consistent decks in the game. And her ability is going to make her very consistent as well. So while I initially wasn't like sold on this character, hearing other people talk about her and then verbalizing everything I just said to you right now, I'm like doing a good job convincing myself that she's going to be pretty good. Let's take a look at her cards and see what kind of... No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to quickly reference the handy dandy rule book on some stuff that might matter. So many of Miss Marvel's cards check for how many zones fighters are in. She is in more zones than an opposing fighter if she is in a multicolored space with more colors than the opposing fighter's space. She shares no zones with an opposing fighter if her space has none of the same colors as the opposing fighter's space. So those are just some handy things to keep in the back of your mind when we're talking about some of her card effect triggers. Another thing to note is it says when Miss Marvel attacks a fighter who is not adjacent to her using her ability, it is still considered a melee attack, which technicalities, good to know. So now we're getting into her cards. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Her first card is Big Windup. This is a 4-value attack with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. And it says, during combat, if Miss Marvel's space shares no zones with the opposing fighter, you may boost this card. Something we just talked about to help us understand some of the card effects. Planning ahead is pretty nice. Good job, Baked. You can pat yourself on the back. So this is a card that lets you boost, and its base value is 4, which means you're probably going to be able to get some damage in against your opponent. If they play a premium block value like 4, you can pretty reliably boost this for 2, maybe even 3 damage, depending on what's in your hand. And if they block with something that's 3 or lower, you're going to be really happy with that exchange. The one caveat is you have to share no zones with the opposing fighter, which on some maps might be a lot easier than others, like Sarpedon, when there are a lot of hard zone cutoffs, or Hero Rot, where there's kind of like weird zoning things. But on a map like Memorial, if your opponent is parked in the middle garden area in the green and blue zones, you're probably not going to find a space that shares no zones with their space for like a county mile. So Miss Marvel is a little map dependent in this regard and with some of the other effects on her cards, but that kind of relies on randomness of what map you're playing on and kind of how good your opponent is, because if they are very careful in position around this effect ever being able to trigger, that's going to be a little annoying. And I have experience with that because Navy Pier, the map that comes in the Teen Spirit box, I think is awful for Miss Marvel. There are 3 or 4 spaces on that map, I think, where if your opponent is just sitting, there's no way for you to attack them and not be in the same zone as them. And if your opponent just like runs back between those couple spaces all game, you're never going to be able to trigger this card. And that's kind of annoying to lose that damage output, because she has other ways of dealing damage, but like this is like a pretty nice one. And unfortunately, I don't think you can reliably trigger it. But having 3 copies of an attack you can boost that starts at a 4 value is very scary, and your opponent is going to have to be just constantly aware of the threat this card poses and play around it, which could help in your favor, because anything that makes your opponent more mentally taxed during a game is a fun little advantage to have. The next card is I'm Not Touching You. I'm not touching you. Palm does not like the artwork for this card, but anyways, it is another 4 value attack with a boost value of 1 and 3 copies, and it says after combat, if Miss Marvel's space shares no zones with the opposing fighter, draw 2 cards. So this is the same vibe as Big Windup. It's a 4 value attack that cares about if you share no zones with the opposing fighter. So I'm kind of not really going to go into that effect, since everything I just said about Big Windup applies to I'm Not Touching You. But I'm Not Touching You's effect is drawing 2 cards, which in today's competitive meta, maybe not today's, like 6 months ago, drawing cards was like not a good thing, because like exhaustion endgames were like a lot of things that heroes relied on. But I think the meta is slowly getting pushed more and more aggressive, with characters like Houdini and T-Rex and Cloak and Dagger coming out. So drawing cards should be viewed as like a positive effect. There was a time when it wasn't, and it was like, well, if you play Riches Beyond Compare, like you're just going to lose. But drawing cards is a good thing. It helps you be aggressive. It helps you keep up with your opponent's aggression. Certain characters, like this one, care about how big their hand is, and being able to just gain tempo from drawing cards, which means you can attack more, is great, especially for a character that might not have to maneuver every turn if they can just move 1 space and then reach their opponent to attack. So drawing cards is a great way to refill your hand without having to maneuver. And so there are circumstances where getting this card's effect is great. The problem is it overlaps with Big Windup, which means if you ever have both of these in your hand and you could trigger the effect, you'd probably want to trigger Big Windup, just because damage is damage, and usually that's what you're going to go for. The other downside is if you're playing this card for the effect and you actually want the effect, it has the same trigger as Big Windup, which is a card your opponent wants to cancel, which means you might not get the card draw effect when you like want to play this card most, which isn't the worst thing in the world, because it deals 2 damage over a feint, and if they're feinting this, it means they're not feinting a Big Windup. But you may have like wasted that share no zone opportunity to make this attack. But I guess if you're attacking into a cancel, you'd rather play this and have it get canceled in general, and have a later opportunity, hopefully if you get one, to play Big Windup for damage. So interesting overlap with how your opponent is going to play around it, in terms of like what effect they think you're playing, but also like if they're going to let you trigger those effects, and of course that depends on the map again. So another solid card. Big Windup definitely, like, I think better overall in your game plan of actually killing your opponent, but I'm Not Touching You can really shine in certain game states and boards and scenarios, which every card can, which I guess isn't super constructive, but like, I don't know. Big Windup is like great when it works, and I'm Not Touching You I think is just like good most of the time. Fangirl is a 0 value attack with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies, and it says during combat the value of this card is equal to the number of cards in your hand. So basically, Sattler is going na at Miss Marvel because her version of this card is purple, which means she can defend with it, whereas Miss Marvel can only attack with hers. So Restoration printed a card that is strictly worse than an existing card. The world will devolve into madness and chaos. What are they thinking? No, this is just like a solid attack. It gives you a reason to want to draw more cards with I'm Not Touching You and other effects you have in your deck, and it makes you want to play at a larger hand count during the game so that the threat of this card is scary, because if you have a full hand and then you're attacking someone, well, they don't really want to get hit with a 6, do they? So this is just like a really solid card to throw out when you do have a large hand size, although you probably don't want to play it if it's not going to be at least a 5 or a 6. And it's a nice card to play when your opponent is playing around big windup, because then they can either cancel it and get off scot-free because it's a printed 0, so it won't deal any damage without the effect. But if they're canceling this, they won't be able to cancel one of your big windups later if you get the chance to play it. So this is just like, I think, the general attack you should be relying on, and keep your hand size big so that it's always scary. Really, really good card. The next card is Slingshot. It is a defense-only blue with a boost. It's a 3-value defense-only blue with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. And it says, after combat, place Miss Marvel in any space in her zone. So, 3-value blocks, solid block. It's good, not great. And the after combat movement effect is really good because it can help you break pins and combos, and it can help you position to set up the start of your next turn, because you can just like teleport to somewhere else in your zone so that you can immediately attack your opponent while not being adjacent to them. This is like a really good block card just in general for mobility. It combines with your ability really well, because the first thing you do at the start of your turn is move 1 space. So this can kind of like give you extra maneuverability, because you'll just teleport somewhere and then you'll be able to move 1 space at the start of your turn. So this gift card gives you a lot of options, especially given on kind of like navigating around your opponent's fighters if they have like a bunch of sidekicks or something. So really solid card, really solid mobility card. There will be some maps where if you're just like in the middle of a huge zone where you have a bunch of options, where this card can like really come in clutch and just put you in like prime positioning to do something amazing. So another really solid card for Miss Marvel. And that is the only blue card she has. The first purple is Embiggen, a 3-value versatile with a boost value of 3 and 3 copies. And it says, during combat, if Miss Marvel is in more zones than the opposing fighter, the value of this card is 6 instead. So it's a purple 3 that goes to a 6, so it's kind of like jump scare for Bloody Mary. But the combat effect is kind of hard to trigger. Take Hero Rot, for example, which is a map that only has mono zone spaces and bi-zone spaces. So if your opponent is standing in a bi-zone space, this card just cannot trigger on that map. Take a map like Navy Pier, which comes in the Teen Spirit box. There's 1 tri-zone space on that board and like 5 bi-zone spaces, and usually if your opponent is standing on a bi-zone space, you won't be able to trigger this card. Do you see where I'm going? There are some maps that will make it very hard for you to trigger that card, this card. And that's kind of unfortunate. Maybe if you're like camping one of the tri-zone spots on Sarpedon, you can reliably trigger this card, but that requires your opponent having initiative so that they're coming to you, which might not be a realistic game state, considering that if you're trying to play at a high hand count and pressure your opponent with a high number of cards in hand, you might be relying on that like move 4 idea to just constantly chase your opponent around. But in scenarios where you're not doing that and your opponent is chasing you, this card, I think, is going to be good. Except it's another like pretty map dependent card, and I haven't seen this trigger too often in the games that I've played. But It has the potential to be a defensive 6, which is really good for a relatively squishy character with only 14 health and no printed 4s on defense, I believe. And as always, a 6 value attack is nothing to scoff at. And the boost value of 3, pretty good in the big windup. You can get some reliable 7s going from that. So unfortunately, I think this card can fall victim to just smart opponent positioning and a bad map for you. But in theory, it's a really powerful card. The next card is Easy Peasy. It is another 3 value purple with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. And it says after combat, draw 1 card. Then if you have 4 or more cards in your hand, deal 1 damage to an adjacent fighter. So this is another reason why you might want to play at a higher hand count, or at least like a mid to high hand count. If you're defending with this card while you have 4 in hand, you play it, you go down to 3. After combat, you'll draw a card, and then you'll be at 4. So 4 in hand when you have this is the minimum. Although against cards like Ambush or anything with a discard effect, although if you're playing this defensively, most discard effects happen after combat, so you should still be good, but Ambush happens during combat. So anything that like manipulates your hand size or takes a card from you, you probably want to play this when you have like 5 or 6 cards in hand in that certain matchup, so you will actually be able to trigger the effect. But most matchups, you'll be fine playing this at 4 in hand because dealing the damage to an adjacent fighter is good. It really helps if there's like a sidekick you need to ping against Wukong or Robin Hood or something like that, but also just like a melee hero attacking you and just dealing 1 damage back. It's like a counterpunch that draws you a card and deals less damage. It also says, or I should say it doesn't say may, so the damage is not optional. So in 2v2, just make sure you're not forced to ping your partner. But it also says an adjacent fighter, not the opposing fighter, which means you can ping an opposing fighter that was not involved in combat for you. So this is a pretty flexible card, and it's just like good at what it does, which is draw a card, deal a damage. It's kind of like a mini jack of all trades. Nothing too exciting, but card cycling, yay, damage, yay. The next card is Shrink, 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 which reminds me a lot of Deadpool's Eat Me for some reason. It is a 2 value purple with a boost value of 2 and 3 copies. And it says after combat, choose 1 effect. If Miss Marvel's space shares no zones with the opposing fighter, do both. I love cards with choices, by the way, if you didn't know. So the first effect you can choose is your opponent discards 1 card. The second effect you can choose is move the opposing fighter up to 3 spaces. So it's a 2 value purple, which means it's not doing much on offense, and it isn't really value blocking a lot on defense, which isn't great for a kind of squishy 14 health solo hero. So you're really relying on the effect of this card, which more often than not, you're only going to be able to pick 1. I think you probably end up picking the discard more often than not, in which case it's just like a slightly worse clutching clause, but discards are always good, so maybe it helps you pressure like a low hand count opponent. And the moving the opposing fighter part of this card is actually not horrible. Normally it would just be like a whatever thing, but positioning your opponent is great, especially if it's a defense card, because it gives them less time to react and maybe even no time. If it's their second action attacking you, you can move them wherever you want so that on your turn, they're in the prime position to maybe hit with a big windup after you take a little hop. You move them 3 spaces into a different zone, hop so that you're in combat range of them, and then bam, your first action attacking them from a different zone, and maybe you're even in a position to embiggen if you're in a space with more zones than them. So the movement effect can really help you set up some big plays. Is it possible to trigger both of them on defense? Against ranged fighters that aren't bullseye, no, because in order for a ranged fighter to attack you from range, they have to be in your zone, which means you would share zones. Against melee fighters on defense, you could trigger it a lot more reliably, I think, if you're on like a Sarpedon hard zone cutoff and you're kind of standing at the edge of the zone and the opponent has to come up in a different zone and attack you, like if they're in the sand and you're in the green, then you could get both of these effects, which would be pretty nice. But against range, it's not really going to happen. And you could try getting both effects by like attacking when you're not in the same zone as the opposing fighter, but then you're using this card when you could be using I'm Not Touching You or Big Windup, which I think are better offensive options, especially if they get canceled, because then they will actually be dealing damage. And you might not get those opportunities often, so playing Shrink, Shrink, Shrink in that scenario kind of feels like a waste or like a bad opportunity cost for me. And I think in general, defensive discards and movement are better just because your opponent second action discarding a card or being moved somewhere is a lot worse for them than happening when it's not their turn, and then like if it's first action on your turn, maybe you can set something up for second action, but if you're just like attacking second action with this and they discard a card, they're like, oh no, I'm in such a bad spot. They double maneuver and then it's like fine. So I don't think this card is necessarily amazing, but when you can trigger it on defense, it will really shine. I just don't think that's going to happen super often. And again, it's kind of map dependent. The first scheme we're going to talk about that you have is called Gyro and Freeze, as me and my American compatriots would say. Euro and Fries. It's a scheme with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. And it says recover 2 health. Then, if you have 4 or more cards in your hand, gain 1 action. So recovering 2 health is just like a nice little effect. It's what an unsymboled Grim Tail does. It's what Moon Knight's Madness Will Keep You Alive does. You have 2 copies of it, so that's 4 total health recovered, which makes you like an 18 health fighter, which is very solid. And having the healing definitely makes up for like the in general subpar value blocking you're going to do, but your ability kind of offsets that because you shouldn't be attacked as often as some other fighters are. The interesting part of this card for me comes with the action gain, because if you're at a high enough hand count, similar to the easy peasy trigger, you gain an action. So it's like a free heal, which it isn't as impactful as Madness Will Keep You Alive, which also heals you for 2 and gives you an action sometimes, just because that card's boost value being on top of your discard pile matters sometimes, where this kind of like doesn't have that same ordering future trigger effect. It's just kind of like, yeah, I recovered 2 health and like now I can maneuver again on my turn. So it isn't amazing, but healing in this game is better than not healing, which is a famous baked goods-ism. Maybe I'll put on the screen so some people recognize that reference. But when you're trying to play this as a pass, though, which I'm not even sure if Miss Marvel like wants to play for that kind of endgame, you'd have to be at like 4 cards in hand or lower and then play this, and then you would just heal and not gain the action. But I think for the most part it's like a way to kind of take pressure from your opponent, respond to it, say I'm healing this damage back, and then like not lose any tempo in a way because it gives you the action back, and then you can just keep attacking. So I think it's neat in that regard. It just doesn't stand out to me as like an amazing effect by any means. Obviously the healing is good, but like the action gain, I don't know if that makes sense, but like sometimes like on other healing cards, they just like do a little bit more. Like Baptism of Blood also gives you a sister back. Madness will keep you alive, helps you trigger past, present, and future intermingle. And this card, it's like, sure, you just do it for free. So I don't know why I'm necessarily underwhelmed by that. The next scheme in your deck is called Friends and Family. It is a 4 boost value with only 1 copy. It says draw 2 cards, then you may spend an additional action to draw until you have 7 cards in hand. So 1 copy scheme with a boost value of 4 gives me huge A Magician Never Reveals His Secret vibes. Oh boy, I have the feeling that I need to sneeze, but like it's not coming out, so we're just going to power through it. The effect says draw 2 cards, which is good for a character that like cares about their hand size and wants to remain aggressive and generally I think wants to attack with every available action. Drawing 2 cards, so in that case it's good. It also says then you may spend an additional action to draw until you have 7 cards in hand, which can seem like a scary effect, right? Remember what I talked about earlier where it's like, oh, you played this Sinbad scheme that draws you 3 cards, you're just going to auto lose in exhaustion. Well, I think this character just wants to be aggressive, and then having a high hand count with a bunch of cards and a bunch of options works for her. This card also just wins you the game in counter aggression matchups. So like Bruce Lee, Raptors, Bullseye, T-Rex, they all want to just run you out of cards and then hit you big. And this card, you basically turn into Captain America. They deplete your hand, you go, I could do this all day, and you draw up to 7. So in certain matchups, like the Raptor matchup, you drawing this card is just a lose condition for them. And that, I think, is really fun. So this card is definitely going to shine in certain matchups where having more cards than your opponent, having more options than your opponent, and not letting them run you out of options yourself is going to be good. You can't play this second action and spend an additional action because you don't have the action to spend. But it does actually synergize with Euro and Fries because let's say you're at 5 cards, you play Euro and Fries, you gain an action, then you play Friends and Family, draw 2, and then spend your remaining action, because the healing was free, to draw the other 2 cards. So I think there is a little bit of synergy actually now that we verbalize that out between Euro and Friends. How often that will actually come into play, I'm not entirely sure, but you could do a cool play where you double Euro, gain the actions, and then still just like draw back up to 7. So yeah, I think there's cool potential there, but obviously you're not going to need necessarily the draw up to 7 effect in every matchup, and I think in most of like the long grindy control games, this is probably going to get chucked into big windup to make an 8 value attack. And you only have 1 copy of this, so you can only do that once, but still that's probably like 4 or 5 damage over the top, which is maybe a nice like win condition for you in terms of like just damage output, but it also will be really good in matchups where your opponent doesn't have Fate and they can't cancel big windup. So when you do actually trigger it, you can just put 8 damage into them. The next card is Momentous Shift. This is a card we have all seen before, hopefully. And it just says if Miss Marvel started this turn in a different space, the value of this card is 5 instead. So normally, this card is kind of predictable to see coming. It's like, oh, you jackalope horns and then are attacking me? Or like when Sinbad actually maneuvers up to you and hits you versus like just starting next to you. You can like suss out when a Momentous Shift is coming because it can only come at certain times. Well, you're stretchy and you get to Bruce Lee hop at the start of your turn. which means in theory, if your opponent ever ends adjacent to you, you should always just use this ability, back up 1 space against them, and then attack them first action, which means Momentous Shift could be an attack that triggers on all of your turns, which is really, really good. It basically means when you're attacking your opponent, you have a large hand size. Like you're throwing out like baseline 5s at them. Nice. You basically just like, you're gonna make your opponent value block you until they die. So just really solid card. Hopefully you have some other purples and or blue in your hand so that you don't have to use this on defense, because it will be very good on offense instead. And lastly, we have Faint, which again, I hope by now is a card that everyone has seen before. And you have 3 copies of it, so standard Faint cancel package for this character. I really like the artwork, because a lot of times there's like one character in the Faint like attacking, and then there's one character like dodging, except Miss Marvel's dodge is just like, whoa. Just like on the ground. She's stretchy. I find that so funny. He's like, whoa. Oh, you're trying to hit me? Whoa. So overall, how good do I think this character is going to be? Well, I think my initial opinion on her was a little bit tainted by Navy Pier, because I think Navy Pier is just an awful map for her. I think it's definitely worth doing like a map deep dive, kind of like how I did with Bullseye, to just see like what maps will be really good for her and what maps won't. And I think some of my peers think really highly of this character, and I think I'm just playing a little bit more devil's advocate, because yes, while I do see the hype in her ability, in the fact that she's just going to be chucking 5s at you, and probably with her draw, just like consistently chucking 5s at you all game, the map dependency and the ability of your opponent to play around some of your card effects worries me. So I think she might just like stomp noobs, but like, are we gonna see her in like the highest level of bracket play in tournament? Maybe. It depends on what her matchup spread looks like, because given like full advantage when you can choose the map, and so you know it's going to be good for her, I could see her being an absolute menace. So I think the pessimist in me wants to rank her like low B, but I think she's probably going to be better than Cloak and Dagger, and I said they would be like high B. So Miss Marvel will probably be low A. I think her ability is really going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting in some matchups, because like against some of the heavy hitters, these 2 and 3 value blocks not going to hold up for long. So we'll see how she does. So yeah, I see the high ceiling for her. I think there's a high floor, but I think the high floor is like a foot higher than it actually is. So we'll see. I think she's the one I want to monitor the most out of this set, because if she's really good, I'm going to say like, I'm glad. And if she's not, I'm going to say I told you so. And I don't know if I can root for both sides like that, but hey, I always want to come out on top, so who knows. So those are my thoughts on Miss Marvel. Let me know if you think she's going to be the best character in this set, and which cards of hers are going to be really good, which are not. And let me know what maps you think she's going to be good on, because that is definitely something I'm curious about, and if you would be interested in a video exploring that. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and as always, like, subscribe, and yay!